Good afternoon. It's a privilege to welcome you today on behalf of the Sovereign Order of Malta to our event for World Fisheries Day. This is a moment to reflect on the importance of fisheries to our global economy, food security, and human livelihoods. Today, we are here to discuss a critical and often overlooked issue, the protection and well-being of fishes against human trafficking. I would like to thank all the co-organizers, the International Transport Federation, Preveni Global, Stella Maris, and the Scalabrini International Migration Network, as well as all the permanent missions that sponsor this event, the Holy See, the Philippines, Kenya, the United Kingdom, and the ILO. We gather here today to highlight the widespread abuse faced by fishers worldwide and to identify practical strategies that can mitigate these risks. We aim to leave this gathering with up to 5 concrete, actionable proposals that will enhance global policies addressing modern slavery, human trafficking, and workers' rights, proposals that can be integrated into influential frameworks such as the G20, G7, EU Due Diligence Directive, and other international platforms. Today, more than 50 million people worldwide are victims of human trafficking, with traffickers generating a shocking 236 billion annually from these heinous crimes. It's a tragic reminder that in moments of desperation, the most vulnerable are often targeted by ruthless traffickers who take advantage of their plight. Thank you all for your participation and commitment to the victims and survivors of contemporary slavery. And now, I'm pleased and honored to give the floor to Father Bruno Ciceri, chaplain of Stella Maris, who has a lifelong spiritual commitment to the fishermen and has come from Dubai to be our moderator. Bruno, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Michael, for this introduction. So let us start this event. And first of all, people might say, what is World Fisheries Day? World Fisheries Day is observed every year on November 21st. On this day, fishing community across nations organize events of different kind in order to raise public awareness about the many issues such as overfishing, sustainable global fishery management, climate change, but also human trafficking, forced labor, exploitation, and abuses, all issues which are affecting the artisanal and industrial fishing today. What is the history of World Fisheries Day? World Fisheries Day was initiated in November 21st, 1997, when representatives of small-scale fisher community from 18 countries, they meet in New Delhi in India to launch the World Forum of Fishers People. World Fisheries Day was proposed to raise awareness about the importance of fisheries and the challenges they face. The proposal gained enormous support from the fishing community of the 4 corners around the world and culminated in declaring November 21st as World Fisheries Day. Celebrating World Fisheries Day is about recognizing the human dignity of the millions of people making living out of it and the importance of this profession. So as was already mentioned by Professor Michael, 58 million people are employed on these kind of things. But it's more important to notice that fishing is the world's most dangerous profession. Fish Safety Foundation in 22 research suggested that the problem goes far behind the previous estimate of ILO of 25,000 deaths per year. According to this study, more than 100,000 fishing-related deaths happen each year, 3 to 4 times the previous estimate. Furthermore, with an increase of the free trade agreement between Global South nations and the world's wealthiest economies, the demand for fish has increased. However, in many countries, the availability of people willing to engage in the profession of fisher is in decline, and so with an increased request for migrant workers to seek employment opportunities. Whether a fisher remains within his own region or travel to another continent, incidents of abuses and exploitation of these workers remain high and are increasing. Despite many international treaties, protocols, conventions, and domestic legislation, the protection of fishers remains extremely weak. Even when these are identified and criminal offences are disclosed, successful remedies for fishers are disappointingly few. This needs to change. And this is the reason why this event, titled The Protection and Wellbeing of Fishers Against Human Trafficking, has been organized. The organizer would like to highlight and discuss the chronic problem, human trafficking, forced labor, exploitation and abuses affecting a portion of the fishing industry across the world. The qualified speaker would share which preventing strategies and measures can be introduced or implemented to make fishing a decent and properly remunerated profession free from human and labor rights violations. Before moving on with the program, I would like to inform you that the whole event is live streamed and recorded and be made available on the web in the next few weeks. Furthermore, after the keynote speaker and the panelists, we will have a question-answer session. For the participants present in the room, they can raise their name sign. Once they will be given the permission to intervene, their microphone will be open. Please identify yourself and to which organization you belong. Then say to which of the speakers, panelists you are addressing the question, which must be brief and concise. For the participant online, they can send in the question using the chat box provided by the app WebEx. Write your name and to which organization you belong. Then write to which of the speaker panelists you are addressing the question, again, which must be brief and concise. The moderator will read out the question on your behalf to the speakers. And now, let us start with watching a 2-minute video released by the International Transport Workers Federation Fisheries section on the occasion of the World Fisheries Day 2024.
2500 हो रहे ऑप्शन के अंदर This is a mackerel sardine pilchard. It's octopus.
有鱼。
Yes, yes. Smells so good.
Protection for migrant workers is absolutely central because they're very much out of sight, out of mind.
So we move with Christine Bader, that is the legal specialist at the Maritime and Transport Unit of the Sectorial Policy Department, ILO. She oversees the advancing of decent work in the fishing, shipping, and inland water transport sector. She is currently actively promoting the Maritime Labour Convention 2006 and the Work on Fishing Convention 2007, developing related tools and providing capacity building and technical assistance with a view to achieve their wider ratification, better implementation, and effective enforcement. The floor is yours, Mrs. Bader.
Thank you very much, and happy World Fisheries Day. I'm here to talk about how to protect fishers against forced labor. So, just as a small introduction about the ILO. The ILO was founded in 1919 as and is a specialized agency of the United Nations. Its mandate is social justice, which was translated as decent and productive work in conditions of freedom, equity, security, and human dignity. It is the only tripartite organization in the world where governments, employers' organizations, and workers' organizations have an equal voice and vote. Here you see the fundamental principles and rights at work. They are the human rights among the labor rights. All ILO member states have an obligation by virtue of ILO membership to respect, promote, and realize the fundamental principles and rights at work, whether or not the related fundamental conventions have been ratified. And you see that one of the 5 fundamental principles and rights at work is the elimination of all forms of forced or compulsory labor. Next. What is forced labor? The definition can be found in the ILO Fundamental Convention, the Forced Labor Convention, Convention number 29. And it is all work or service that is exacted from any person under the menace of any penalty and for which the said person has not offered himself voluntarily. Himself or herself, of course. It's a convention of 1930. So you see, the definition has 2 elements. One, involuntariness. So it is not sufficient that the fisher has agreed to work. What is important is that the consent was free and informed. Often there is deception in the recruitment process and abuse of vulnerability. And even if there is consent to enter into an employment relationship, the main elements of the agreement might have changed later. For example, conditions of employment. Circumstances leading to involuntariness are often excessive overtime or very low or no wages. The second element is the menace of any penalty. The fisher must be free to leave. The question is whether the fisher is somehow compelled to work or prevented to leave employment. No. So the examples for a menace of any penalty would be withholding of wages, which is the most frequent one, confiscation of identity documents, exclusion from future employment, dismissal, violence, imprisonment, restriction of movement, denunciation to authorities. According to the 2022 global estimates of modern slavery, 128,000 fishers are trapped as we speak in forced labor aboard fishing vessels, often on the high seas. And this figure is probably a huge understatement due to difficulties to collect statistics. Now, how to protect fishers against forced labor? It is a process with several necessary, consecutive, and interrelated stages. Preventing, detecting, investigating, and prosecuting. For prevention, you need first and foremost a legal framework. The ILO Working Fishing Convention, Convention number 188, covers all aspects of the world of work of fishers. Ratifying states implementing Convention 188 strengthen their national legal framework of labor rights for fishers. This in itself prevents exploitative labor practices. And in particular, the following provisions have a particularly preventive effect on forced labor. Fair recruitment, meaning that fishers must not pay for the job. Fishers must not be blacklisted, which is usually done for complaining or for engaging in trade union activities. And agencies must be licensed to be able to address abusive recruitment practices. Minimum hours of rest, minimum age, which is 16 for fishers to work on board. Written work agreement signed by both parties, comprehensible to the fisher, containing terms of work, copy given to fisher. All this empowers fishers. Crew list, to have all crew members accounted for. Safe manning, payment of fishers monthly or regularly. And food and water provided to fishers at no cost. For prevention, you would also need compliance and enforcement. Ratifying states will, to enforce that law, put in place a system of flag state inspections and eventually port state control, which will detect human rights abuses and exploitative labor practices such as forced labor and human trafficking. The challenge here is coordination at national level. It is absolutely essential. This is transnational organized crime, so we need to get organized to tackle it. Labor, maritime, and fisheries authorities need to collaborate and talk to each other, because labor is not used to board vessels. Maritime is not used to inspect wages. Fisheries have eyes and ears on the high seas and at sea. So these authorities need to be mutually sensitized of each other's work, maybe undertake joint inspections or establish standard operating procedures, protocols to be able to identify red flags, and if they don't have the mandate to act, to know whom to alert and to refer it to the right authority. For prevention as well, important is a set of ILO tools for how to implement and enforce Convention 188 and thus prevent forced labor. And you can see them here, and I can only recommend to use them. As a tripartite organization, we offer them free of charge on our website. You can find them, and these are precious tools to implement and enforce Convention 188, which will prevent forced labor in fishing. Depending on the country context, the ILO approach may include research to identify the challenges, but also capacity building by adapting tools, training inspectors, organizing workshops, including on forced labor. Promotion of sectoral social dialogue and coordination mechanisms between labor, maritime, and fisheries authorities and other relevant authorities, and legal advocacy or technical assistance at the request of member states that wish to implement Convention 188. Moving on to the detection stage. Who is detecting forced labor? Differently from onshore workers, you it will be unusual for police to detect forced labor in the fishing sector. It will usually be inspectors of maritime or fisheries or labor authorities, either in the framework of flag state inspections or port state control. And successful forced labor detection happens via triangulation of data. First of all, the analysis of vessel and crew documentation. So that can be remote risk assessment on shore or documentary review on board. Secondly, the inspection of living and working conditions on board, done by visual observation. And thirdly, last but not least, interviews with fishers, face-to-face contact, of course, trying to avoid retaliation. And once forced labor is detected, what next? The challenge is again coordination, because the detectors, as I already said, are usually the same authorities that enforce Convention 188 and thus prevent forced labor. But they are not those investigating forced labor. So a referral mechanism and a coordination mechanism to the investigating and other relevant authorities like police, immigration authorities, is an absolute must. For detection, you need to work with the ILO 11 forced labor indicators that operationalize the definition of forced labor. First of all, the abuse of vulnerability, for example, child labor. A red flag, for instance, would be a mismatch between crew list and actual crew on board. Deception, an example would be contract substitution. And a red flag for deception would be lack of written work agreements or work agreements in languages that the crew does not speak. Restriction of movement. For example, fishers are held on board while at port to prevent them from fleeing or contacting help. And the red flag would be an excessive number of days at sea. Isolation. For example, fishers have their cell phone confiscated. A red flag for isolation would be change of port or transshipment. Physical and sexual violence. For example, the fishers are subject to violence by the skipper. Intimidation and threats. For example, threats of violence and punishment to the fisher or family to prevent them from speaking up. Or migrant fishers whose work visas are controlled by vessel owners and so that they can be threatened with deportation. Retention of identity documents. So when the skipper holds the passports or visas for safekeeping, preventing the fisher from leaving the vessel. Withholding of wages. For example, wages are being withheld for months or only paid in full at the end of the contract to prevent fishers from ending their contract earlier. A red flag would be repetitive salaries or discrepancies, salaries, pay slips, or discrepancies in salaries recorded. Debt bondage, for example, debts to recruiters, owners, skippers, they are used to keep the fisher in the job. That can be recruitment fees, advances on wages, food costs, etc. Abusive working and living conditions. That's why I said that the whole of the ILO Working Fishing Convention actually tackles forced labor. Example would be, of course, malnutrition, dehydration, overcrowded sleeping rooms, etc. A red flag is usually also inter alia a discrepancy between manning requirements and the number of crew on board. And last but not least, excessive overtime. For example, 20 plus hours of work when there is a large catch, or need to perform other tasks during rest hours. A red flag, again, are repetitive or uniform working hours recorded. Next slide. So here you see the ILO publication, the #1 tool to detect forced labor in commercial fishing. It is called Towards Freedom at Sea. It is a handbook for the detection of forced labor in commercial fishing. And it includes many checklists, questionnaires, risk assessment measures, etc. And we have, for the first time, a free online course on detecting forced labor in commercial fishing, which is currently ongoing and which will no doubt be repeated next year. Lastly, the investigation and prosecution stage. Investigating and prosecuting authorities should collaborate with detecting authorities because they know the sector, the stakeholders, and the vocabulary. So collaboration with the labor, maritime, and fisheries authorities who have detected the forced labor situation is essential. States that have detected forced labor can request international legal assistance, for example, from Interpol. Victims need to be protected, first of all, through immediate and direct assistance, and IOM is very active in that area, through shelters, medical care, etc. Then, not to forget, the victim can first also be perceived as the perpetrator of a crime. Not to forget that forced labor victims must not be prosecuted for unlawful activities they have been compelled to commit. This is Article 4 of the Protocol to Convention 29 on forced labor. And a victim can, at the same time, be a witness, of course. And there, the motto should be repatriation rather than detention, through facilitation of providing written or virtual statements or attendance of trials by virtual means. The victims have suffered enough. Access to remedies, including compensation, is essential. And of course, adequate penalties, because forced labor is a penal offense. Now, illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, IUU, is often associated with forced labor and labor abuse on board fishing vessels. Interpol says that human trafficking and forced labor for labor exploitation have become pillars of IUU fishing operations. This means that combating forced labor helps combat IUU fishing, because forced labor is a facilitative crime. That's again an Interpol term. So the protection of fishers through decent work can be an ally in the fight against IUU fishing. In the light of this nexus, we coordinate at international level. ILO joined forces with FAO and IMO in the Joint Ad Hoc Working Group on IUU fishing and related matters, which combats illegal fishing while promoting safety at sea and decent work. And we coordinate at regional level. Regional fisheries organizations, and we will soon hopefully hear Dr. Bernard. Regional fisheries organizations traditionally focused on the management of fisheries resources, but there is an emerging trend that they are now interested in including a labor dimension in their work, and the ILO has been engaging actively with many of them to promote decent work and the prevention of forced labor in fisheries. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christine. You have given us an overview of the issue of the fishing industry, the instrument that we have to fight against all these problems, but also you have shown how difficult it is to detect the violation, the coordination that is necessary from all the different government institutions to detect all of this, and also to bring this to protection and persecution on these things. You mentioned the free online course, and I think that might be very interesting for the many people from the different NGOs that they are at the moment listening and following to us online. I invite you to go to the ILO website and eventually to get registered to make this course for next year, so that you will have more instruments in your hands to detect the cases and to provide assistance to the fishers in troubles. And now we give the floor to Dr. Miguel Bernal. If he's online, the floor is yours. From Rome, let us listen to Dr. Bernal.
So, Your Excellency, Professor Michel Beuthi, dear organizers, distinguished speakers, esteemed colleagues, it's both a privilege and an honor to speak today on this topic of critical importance for coastal communities across our region, the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. And I will be talking about the role of fisheries and aquaculture in creating jobs, supporting livelihoods, and ensuring decent work for those who depend on the sea for their living. I only wish I could be there with you in person to better engage in today's discussion, but unfortunately this was not possible this time. These issues of decent work are at the heart of the mandate of the General Fisheries Commission for the Mediterranean, as we already heard the previous speaker as well. As the regional fisheries management organization for the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, we play an essential role in guiding the governance of fisheries and aquaculture towards the sustainable use of our shared marine resources. However, this requires an integrative approach where all stakeholders are involved. Fishers, aquaculture farmers, and fish workers along the entire value chain are indispensable partners in realizing these goals. Therefore, reducing their vulnerability and enhancing their well-being and resilience is central to our mission. The Mediterranean and the Black Sea are home to rich biodiverse ecosystems that provide vital sources of food and livelihoods for thousands. According to the most recent GFCM report on the state of Mediterranean and Black Sea fisheries, SOMFI, fisheries and aquaculture together support approximately 700,000 jobs in the region, encompassing direct employment in fishing and aquaculture, as well as indirect jobs in, among others, areas such as port services, processing, and retail. Of particular note, women represent nearly 30% of the workforce in these sectors, particularly engaged in fish processing and marketing, though often in informal or low-paid roles. The economic contribution of fisheries and aquaculture to the region is substantial, with an estimated annual value exceeding USD 20.5 billion. But beyond these figures, the importance of these sectors runs deeper. Fisheries have long been integral to the cultural fabric and social cohesion of coastal communities, providing a nutritious source of food ingrained in the region's culinary traditions. Similarly, aquaculture is increasingly vital, supporting livelihoods and playing an essential role in meeting the growing demand for fish protein. However, as we are discussing here today, we must go beyond simply promoting revenue and job creation within these sectors. We must focus on ensuring that these are decent jobs, ones that are productive, offer fair incomes, guarantee safe working conditions, and provide adequate social protections. Indeed, a pressing challenge we face in the Mediterranean and the Black Sea is the aging workforce. As a result of difficult working conditions, low earning potential, and a lack of social safety nets, younger generations are not drawn to the sector. In turn, many communities face the prospect of a shrinking workforce, which threatens the production capacity and economic viability of these sectors. Ensuring adequate workers' rights and social protection programming is therefore a cornerstone of any long-term sustainability strategy for fisheries and aquaculture. This is where the GFCM comes in. In recent years, we have been working hard to advocate for decent work across the fisheries and aquaculture sectors, drawing attention to the need of the sectors and urging political commitment towards fair, safe, and equitable employment opportunities. Through the GFCM's 2030 strategy, adopted in 2021, we have outlined a clear path for ensuring decent employment and engaged fishers in the Mediterranean and Black Sea. Target 4 of this strategy specifically aims to advance the principle of decent work by promoting fair and safe working conditions, improving access to social protection, and supporting the ratification of international labor conventions. This includes encouraging our members to ratify the ILO Work in Fishing Convention, as well as other complementary instruments aimed at eliminating illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. The Work in Fishing Convention, which I'm sure you will hear more, we have already heard a little bit from our colleague at the ILO, is particularly important, setting out labor standards for workers on board fishing vessels, covering issues such as hours of work, rest periods, safety, and protection from accidents. It is an essential tool for improving working conditions and ensuring the rights of fishers. Additionally, at the GFCM, we have been working to improve social protection access for workers in the sector, many of whom lack access to basic programming like health insurance, pension, or unemployment benefits. We are advocating for better policy coherence between fisheries and social protection ministries to ensure fishers and aquaculture farmers are not left behind, particularly when they face economic hardships or changes in the sector. We are also working to raise awareness about the informal and seasonal nature of fisheries-based work, as this often proves a barrier to access existing social protection programming. On this topic, we have seen meaningful progress in recent years, particularly for the small-scale fisheries sector. Strong political will was expressed for the need for decent work and improved social protection for all small-scale fisheries working in the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, through the signature of a ministerial declaration on a regional plan of action for small-scale fisheries. This was also followed by a resolution adopted by the GFCM in 2022, which further emphasizing the need to ensure adequate social protection is available for these small-scale fishers. These advances have also been supported by a study we have carried out together with the FAO Fisheries and Aquaculture Division on social protection for small-scale fisheries in our region. This study aimed to identify the conditions and vulnerabilities of fishers, along with best practices in the provision of social protection programs and policies, and ultimately proposing recommendations to improve coverage and effective delivery of these programs. In conclusion, we recognize that fisheries and aquaculture are foundational to the economic and social fabric of our region. To ensure the long-term sustainability of these sectors and protect against harmful practices, we must prioritize decent work for all workers, encourage young people to pursue careers in this industry, and ensure equal opportunities for women throughout the fisheries value chain. The GFCM remains committed to supporting our members in achieving these goals through targeted actions and the promotion of international labor standards. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Miguel, for your presentation. The fact that you have underlined that this sector is not important only for its economic value, but especially for the great number of people that they are involved in this profession. It's important that you underline the necessity to guarantee guarantee decent work and social protection in order to attract younger generation that they are not interested anymore on fishing because of the long hours of work and the small earning that they can make. And it's necessary to ratify the C-188 Convention, but most of all, after the ratification, also the implementation of the C-188. And now I would like to call on His Excellency Archbishop Ettore Balestrero, Apostolic Nuncio, Permanent Observer of the Holy See of the United Nations Office at Geneva, to read the World Fisheries Day message from the Dicastery of Promoting Human Integral Development. The floor is...
Thank you very much, and I'm very pleased to read the message of the Prefect of the Dicastery for Promoting Integral Human Development, His Eminence Cardinal Michael Czerny, on the occasion of the World Fisheries Day, as you mentioned, which is celebrated today. Dear brothers and sisters, the waters of the deep often appear in sacred scripture as a symbol of the instability and restlessness that are part of our human experience. God's people, however, remain firm in hope, for the covenant between heaven and earth is solid and renders even the sea traversable. This imagery speaks to our minds and hearts and alters our perception of our daily work and its accompanying challenges. The annual celebration of World Fisheries Days offers us a particular opportunity to deepen our relationship with sister water and with the integral human development of all. Fishing, which is one of the most ancient forms of human work, has greatly changed in many parts of our planet. The harm done to our common home by an aggressive and divisive economic model can be said to have directly affected the life and future of millions of human beings who make their living from fishing. Age-old equilibria between human labor and the natural environment have been disrupted by predatory practices and the use of technology for the benefit of an increasingly influential and powerful minority, unconcerned for the medium and long-term effects of this lethal economy. Thus, the creative command, "Let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures," from Genesis chapter 1, verse 20, has been violated by intensive fishing, which is excluding those who for centuries have cared for the riches of the seas, rivers, and Great Lakes. The Church shares in the joys and hopes, but also the sorrows and grief of a humanity called at this moment in history to rediscover fraternity as a social and political reality, and the culture of encounter as an alternative to the globalization of indifference. Christians cannot look the other way when entire ecosystems are menaced by practices that prove devastating and impoverish, even to the point of starvation, peoples who already suffer from discrimination and conflict. The recently concluded Synodal Assembly was an extraordinary occasion for reciprocal listening and a growing realization that in meeting these challenges, the mission of the Church is clear. To all those who acknowledge the effects of a negative paradigm of development, I would like to recall the Holy Father's Pope Francis' recent message to popular movements. You have moved beyond passivity and pessimism. Do not give in now to pain or resignation. You were unwilling to be docile victims, but saw yourself as a group, active participants in history. This is perhaps your most important contribution. You did not step back, but took the lead. Do not let yourselves be intimidated. Move forward. In this way, the Church would like fishers throughout the world to sense her accompaniment and support. A technological development can exist and be pursued that is capable of upholding the dignity and security of labor, and restoring a balance between individuals, work, and the environment. Lawmakers, too, can stand back from the great interests of a few and intervene on behalf of small communities, family businesses, and organizations of fishers who, given suitable assurances, are in a position to contribute more directly and effectively to the common good. For theirs is a vocation to care for the sea, which must be protected within the purview of an integral, widespread, and people-oriented ecology. This sensitivity fully makes fishers part of the members of the body of Christ who cooperate in the building of a world more faithful to God's dreams. As men and women of hope, let us remember the potent silence of prayers, which must always accompany our efforts on behalf of justice. Again, Pope Francis has said, I pray that the economically powerful will come out of their isolation, reject the false security of money, and be open to sharing the goods that are destined for all because they come from creation. All goods come from there, and the goods of creation are destined for all. It is difficult for this to happen. It is difficult, but for God nothing is impossible. This is also our prayer as we entrust to the intercession of Mary, Star of the Sea, the concerns and aspirations of fishers and all those who benefit from their work. Cardinal Michael Czerny, Prefect. Thank you very much.
Archbishop Balestrero for reading out the message for World Fisheries Day from the Dicastery for Promoting Human Integral Development. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jessica Spark, that is Adjunct Assistant Professor for the Master in Conservation Medicine program at the Cumming School of Veterinary Medicine and Research Assistant Professor in the Division Food, Agriculture, Environment, and also is an Associate Director of the University of Wright Lab Ecosystem and Environment Program and Assistant Professor of Anti-Slavery Economics at the University of Nottingham. Join us online from Boston is Dr. Spark. The floor is yours.
So thank you for the introduction. I'll be brief. Father Bruno has asked me to be brief. And we've already heard from others that have introduced the problem. So as Ms. Botter mentioned, the ILO estimates 128,000 fishers globally are estimated to be working in conditions of forced labor at a given time. And when we conceptualize working conditions, of course, forced labor, human trafficking, modern slavery is on the extreme end, but I often think about working conditions as a continuum. And of course, on the very good end, we have decent work, which is, we have minimum norms and standards from things such as the Work and Fishing Convention, but also a host of other ILO conventions, violence and harassment, freedom of association, right to organize and collectively bargain, etc. Is it allowing me to share now? It is not. Okay. But in the middle, decent work isn't just the absence of its antithesis, the really bad forced labor. We also have a whole range of other working conditions that are violations of decent work, but may not reach the threshold of forced labor. And so when thinking from a research perspective, I often group these into labor abuses, which would be just to the right of decent work. I have a nice slide with a continuum that may or may not appear, but that's okay. So labor abuses, violations of labor rights and norms, but not always necessarily violations of laws, because we know that fishing labor in particular can often be unregulated, or things like wage discrimination, which we often think of as a normative labor right, but may or may not be regulated in law by a particular state. And then moving down the spectrum towards the really egregious side, labor exploitation, which I've defined as violations of actual labor laws and regulations, but not meeting that threshold of forced labor. And why that's important is because we know that those abuses and exploitive practices often give rise to the extremely bad instances or egregious violations that result in forced labor. So with that framework in mind, a couple of years ago, we set out to do a global survey of fishers in collaboration with Stella Maris and also with the International Transport Workers Federation, who I believe we'll be hearing from next. As part of that study, over 2 years, collected over 4,000 surveys from fishers all over the world. And those fishers are from 109 different nationalities. 93% of them were identified as migrant fishers, and that may be transnational migration, but we also see in some countries domestic migration, which is also important to consider. For example, we have some data from fishers in India who migrated from one coast to the other coast, and social security protections don't necessarily follow when they migrate internally. In that data set, we also have those workers working on vessels flagged to 92 countries. And those vessels, we didn't ask about every port they visited, but the ports where the crew were boarding or disembarking or where they were taking the survey. And that was over 400 ports in over 60 countries. And the vessel size ranged anywhere from less than 10 meters to giant factory trawlers over 100 meters. And so you see a very wide range of working conditions, a very wide range in diversity of experiences in the data set. Going back to that continuum, so what we wanted to do is the survey was actually almost 100 questions, and it had 9 sections. Things such as basic information about the fisher, their pre-departure experiences, which would be about recruitment practices, how they find out about the job, debt, fees, etc. Their fisherman's work agreement or contract, their wages, salary payments, their general working conditions, things like work and rest hours, discrimination, health and safety on board the vessel, vessel behaviors or vessel characteristics, so elements of illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, for example, the gear type of the vessel, and then a section on broadly labor rights. So how familiar are they with their labor rights? How comfortable are they with accessing grievance channels? Do they trust them? Do they understand how to use them? Would they use them, etc.? And so taking the totality of each survey, we tried to compare them against the benchmarks of the international ILO conventions, and then also the state regulations for each flag state. So was there a minimum wage law that applies to migrant fishers on that vessel flagged to that country, dependent on where that vessel fishes? We know in some places, such as Taiwan, the minimum wage laws vary by where the vessel itself is fishing. So benchmarking each survey against these international conventions, as well as flag state laws, we try to categorize each survey, so each fisher's experience, into those buckets along that continuum of working conditions. And what we found was that approximately only 3% of the fishers surveyed were working in conditions of decent work. So every element as set out in the Work and Fishing Convention and those other conventions was met. And about 19% in working in conditions that would be abusive, so labor abuses, 67% in labor exploitation, and then about 11% in forced labor, human trafficking, potentially. Of note, that 3% working in conditions of decent work, it is highly skewed towards those represented by a union or a part of a union. Some of the key findings, because as you can imagine, with 4,000 surveys and 100 questions, we have a lot of data. And I don't want to repeat with others since we have a limited amount of time, but reinforcing that the most frequently occurring violation in each of those 3 buckets of violations was related to wages. And why that's really important is because workers seem very hesitant to leave the vessel if they haven't been paid, out of concern that they won't be able to retrieve their wages if they return home, particularly if they're a migrant fisher. Some other things that I think are interesting to think about is coercion around contracts. And so because the vessel may be in a country far away from the flag state, far away from the fisher's own country, they often feel like they are compelled to renew their contract, even if they would rather return home, because they're told, their repatriation might not be paid for, etc., or that they're violating the existing contract and they're going to lose rights and entitlements, or their debt was too high and they feel like they need to renew the contract because they're being incentivized with lower fees. May not reach the threshold of forced labor, but certainly can appear quite coercive. And so important to think about these manifestations that might be unique to fishing. And then nationalities on board the vessels seem to be increasing. I would argue that that might be intentional by vessel owners to squash solidarity building. So different languages, fighting on board, etc. And actually, if I go back to my point, train of thought about coerced contracts, why I think that coercion of contracts is really important is because often companies use the renewal of a contract as a proxy for good working conditions. So they assume that if a fisher has renewed their contract, they must have good working conditions, which is why I think that manifestation of coerced contracts is particularly interesting. And, we talk a lot about the nationalities that do work on board these vessels. In our data set, from a statistical point of view, we look to see if any of these variables statistically predict a poor outcome of working conditions. And while nationality is not a predictor in that, if you're Indonesian, that means it's a predictor of being in poor working conditions, precarious immigration was. So immigration statuses that bind you to a single employer, that deny you the ability to leave the vessel, etc. So tied visa regimes, the absence of an immigration status, etc., was a significant predictor of all these different types of different deficits. And one last thing I want to highlight is that mental health concerns were widely reported. I know it doesn't often fall neatly under these norms and definitions and indicators of decent work, but one of the outcomes of witnessing having your own poor working conditions, witnessing the abuse of others, and also as a fisherman, an event I had yesterday so eloquently stated, nothing changes. And when nothing changes, that also puts pressure on their mental health, in addition to just the elements of fishing, being isolated, being away from your family, etc. So I apologize, that was very, very quick. But with that, I will wrap up and say thank you and hand it over to the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Jessica. Sorry for the problem with your slides. It was very good that you talk about the research that you have done with Stella Maris, and I think usually we have only narrative report of what's happened on board, what are the with your research that we hope it will be published soon, we will have statistics about the problems and the issue of the fishers they are experiencing in their life. And now I would like to introduce a very special panelist because he is a living witness of what we often hear about it, of what happened in a portion of the fishing industry, not so much in a developing country as often we think, but also in a developed nation. So Noel Selorm Adabla is from Ghana. He is one of the 6 children. His father is a fisherman and the mother a fishmonger. After completing the secondary school, he saw an opportunity in the fishing industry, so he went into apprenticeship to study welding at the fishing harbor. And after graduating, he decided to pursue welding and fishing as a main occupation. He got his certification to work in the fishing industry abroad. He worked in the tuna fleet in Iran and then got through a UK transit visa, was trafficking to Ireland and subject to labor exploitation and abuse. With the help of the International Transport Workers Federation, he became documented and now has a legal status in Ireland, where he is currently working in the construction sector. From Ireland, let us listen to Noel recalling his story. Noel?
Hello. Yeah.
Okay.
Hello. Hello.
Go ahead. We
Yeah,
hear
this
you.
is Noel. As you said, my name is Noel Saloma Dabla, and I'm originally from Ghana, but currently an Irish citizen. Yeah, I just want to narrate a bit of my experience as a fisherman traveling from Ghana to Iran and to Ireland as a fisherman. I might say, with my experience concerning fishing, most of us in undeveloped country mostly think the advanced countries have better system of fishing or working condition compared to what we have. But until we travel before we realize how deprived the situation is. And I think most people don't see the reality of the situation, because most people who are engaged into the fishing administration don't really have the on-site view of the fishing industry. So I just want to use this opportunity to tell you my experience. I think for the first time going to a foreign country, Iran, as a fisherman, I have to pay an agent. You know, the agent takes so much money from you that this money becomes a debt, that even when you go for fishing, the amount that you are being paid cannot even help you to take care of yourself or to even pay for your debt back home, you know. And most of us get so much frustrated, you know, and we go to these vessels or working on a boat. I know people who have been on vessels for 4 years just because they didn't have a good pay, wages, salary. You know, you work for so many months and people take advantage of you, you know. And I might use my experience coming to Ireland. I have to also use the same process, meet an agent who took thousands of euro, not just from me, from my colleagues. You sign a contract, you come to Ireland. I came to Ireland promising of so many things. But when I came, there was no place for us to sleep. There was no food. You know, the working conditions were very terrible. You know, when you said this, you tell your boat owner, your skipper, they don't really care about anything, you know, because they feel like there are instances, if you come, they try to take your passport from you, and that is the main thing they do. You know, they try to take those documents from you. So when they take those documents from you, they make you deprived, they make you vulnerable, you know, and also they restrict you from going outside and to tell people your problems. So these are some of the challenges I would like to talk about. And also in terms of wages, fishermen work so much excessive hours that they don't get they don't get what they should be paid for. People work 40 hours, 50 hours, and there's nothing to write home about. You know, so most of this contract that the skippers or the boat owners give us is just a scam. That's how I will call it. They just scam you, and when you get yourself into it, there's no way of turning back. You know, so these are some of the things I would like to talk about, and I will also want to mention how people there's a lot of racism, you know, abuse on the vessels, especially those of us from the West Africa or Africa countries. You know, most of these skippers see us and they don't see us for anything, although you work with them 24/7. They still don't give you the respect that you deserve. You know, they treat you anyhow. If you get injured, they try to connive with their boat owners and send you back home. And these are some of the challenges we are facing as a fisherman. And I would like your institution to be able to help to address some of these issues. Thank you.
Heard until now, there are true things that happen, and I think Noel is just one of the many people that they are suffering this kind of exploitation, abuses, and other things. So thank you very much for putting your face and for telling us your story. And now I would like to remind, if you have any question to ask, you can, especially for the people online, they can put it on the chat box of the application, and later we will have time to address the question. Now I would like to present you Chris William, that is from the International Transport Workers Federation, the Fisheries Sector Coordinator. He works in the fishery community and development project since 2004. He's been member of Unite, the union, for 20 years. Before that, he worked as a fishery researcher for New Economics Foundation for 10 years. Since January 2021, he has been working at the fishery section of the International Transport Workers Federation, leading UK and Latin American project to develop with local affiliated ITF union, the union in this country. Following the recent Congress of the ITF in October 2024, Chris is now working as a fisheries section coordinator at the ITF. Joining us online from London is Mr. William Chris.
Thank you all so much for your time and your attendance. Thank you very much to Noel for talking about the experiences that he had in Ireland and also in Iran. We really appreciate your time and input, and it's so important for these different institutions to hear directly from workers. And thanks also to Jess for presenting an overview of the excellent research that you've been involved in. I'm going to talk about ITF. For those that don't know, the International Transport Workers Federation is a democratic affiliate-led trade union federation. We represent around 700 affiliated unions, representing nearly 17 million workers in 152 countries. In terms of what we do, the role of the ITF really is to provide a platform for millions of transport workers to ensure that their voices are heard, and that includes through our work with the UN agencies, where we're the tripartite partner representing unions with the ILO as a part of the tripartite process with governments, unions and employers. We're also a social partner at the International Maritime Organization and also work with the UN Food and Agricultural Organization on issues around IUU fishing. One of the transport sectors that we organize in and have members in is the fisheries section, which I now coordinate. We have 150,000 members from 90 affiliated unions in 59 countries. And our work focuses on organizing, collective bargaining, collective action and solidarity with fishers globally. What we want to see is a world where all fishers have the legal right to freedom of association and collective bargaining, receive living wages and fair treatment for the difficult and dangerous work that they do, and can work in safety and are protected from exploitation and abuse, and can access grievance mechanisms that are trusted and effective and provide remedy for workers. Our objectives are really to develop and promote global standards in the fishing industry. We want to support fishers to form unions and build power, or join unions if they're already present, to promote good working conditions and health and safety on board these fishing vessels, and also provide a platform for fishers' unions to connect and learn from each other. That can be regionally or it can be internationally. We also want to build political and industrial leverage to advance fishers' rights and support collective bargaining in the workplace. Our goal really is to raise standards in the fishing industry and stop the race to the bottom that leads to the kind of situation that Noel was describing. A large part of that is around campaigns for the ratification of C188, the ILO Working Fishing Convention, also C190 on violence and harassment at work. We firmly believe that it is time for fishers to get an equal and fair share of the massive profits that global seafood companies make from their labor. There are 38 million people who are engaged either full-time or part-time in capture fisheries. The vast majority, around 80%, are from Asia, followed by Africa. But what's really important to note is that we believe that only around 2% of fishers are organized in trade unions. We believe that that is something that has to change to guarantee decent work in the fishing sector. In Europe and North America, I think it's fair to say that people have a very romanticized view of what the fishing industry is, and a lot of that is based around our understanding of coastal fisheries and small-scale fisheries. But that's not necessarily what's reflected in the reality of the fishing industry on the high seas and outside of those kind of coastal small-scale fisheries. Fishing is a very difficult and very dangerous job. And as we heard Bruno say earlier, the Fish Safety Foundation in 2022 estimated 100,000 deaths per year in relation to commercial fishing. So occupational safety and health is very poor in fishing and is way behind other parts of the maritime sector. Fishing is often viewed as completely different and distinct from other kinds of employment. Traditionally, fishers were paid a share of the catch, and the idea was that they would get an equal reward for the equal risk and equal endeavor of going out with vessel owners. But that has obviously changed in recent decades as the industrial fishing sector has moved towards recruiting employed fishers or migrant workers to undertake the work as deckhands primarily. Fishing has often been outside of traditional labour market enforcement, and as we heard before, even in developed countries like the UK or Ireland or other European countries, it's outside of the labour market enforcement system. It's also outside of the usual tax system. For example, in the UK, we have employees and self-employed workers. Share fishers have their own legal and tax status, even in the UK. So fishing has really been outside of the norms and regulations in other sectors and is very much behind when it comes to decent work, occupational health and safety. And part of that is because it's hard to reach these vessels. It's hard to do labour inspections, especially for vessels that are out at sea for months or years at a time. And because of the traditional catch share model, where workers were incentivized to work many, many hours to get an equal share, contracting someone to work for a certain amount of hours per week or month and then forcing them to work excessive hours is completely different. Fishing is not really like any other industrial workplace. It also intersects with multiple different agencies, which makes joint inspections complicated. You need to have agreements between different government departments and clear responsibilities and roles when it comes to enforcement of decent work conditions. And that's mainly because fisheries is obviously a catching sector for food. So you have the fisheries and food hygiene, sustainability angle. You have the labor component, obviously, for both self-employed and employed fishers. You have safety, you have maritime pollution, you have the port authorities, and also obviously when you're contracting migrant workers, there's also the immigration issue. So all of those government agencies need to be coordinated, and that's also true at the UN level. This is why, for example, the joint working group on IUU needs to include IMO, FAO, and ILO. This change over the last 20 years has meant that migrant workers are recruited into the sector through recruitment agencies, and as we heard from Noel, that often comes through the extraction of illegal fees and debt bondage and human trafficking, bringing people in that don't have work permits to work in a country such as Ireland through the UK route, which is the shocking experience that Noel had. Often for that reason also there's literacy and language barriers. So there's also a difficulty in terms of contacting and getting clear testimony from workers when it comes to government agencies. Overall, the issue is really that fishing vessels are out of sight and out of mind and poorly understood in terms of how the sector actually operates. And the migrant workers that have been crewing these industrial fishing vessels for many decades are basically an invisible workforce to a large extent, which is why we think it's so important that workers like Noel get to tell their story. The ILO has told us that nearly 50 million people live in modern slavery, and that can be forced labor in the private sector, forced labor for commercial sexual exploitation, or forced labor imposed by a state. Most of those are in Asia, but the highest prevalence is actually in the Arab world. And addressing decent work deficits in the informal economy, which includes a very, very high percentage of the jobs in fishing, is an absolute priority for any progress to be made against forced labour. It's clear that fishing is a high-risk sector, and the 2021 estimates from the ILO, which Jess also mentioned, is that at least 128,000 victims of forced labour exist in the fishing industry. But because the sector is very isolated and hard to reach, the actual figure is very likely to be considerably higher. The forced labour indicators that we're familiar with obviously apply to all sectors, but if you consider these 11 indicators and think about the distant water fleet, most of these are present all the time, and very prevalent. So the abuse of vulnerability for migrant workers, language barriers, deception, contracts that are longer or pay that is lower, restriction of movement, they're on the vessels, isolated, obviously they could be at sea for a year or two at a time, intimidation, threats, violence, retention of documents, as Noel said, is also very common, as is, as Christina said, withholding of wages. No, we'll pay you at the end of the trip in order to extract free and forced labour from workers, and debt bondage, as we again heard from Noel. Excessive overtime used to be the norm in fishing, but it wasn't overtime, it was a share. So if you don't sleep for 3 days because the fishing is good, you get a good return. That's still true for share fishermen that are self-employed, but contracted workers are being forced to work excessive hours. So that's why we need to see broad ratification of C-188, currently only ratified by 21 countries, which doesn't even include some of the world's biggest fishing nations. We need C-188 as a minimum standard enshrined in legislation around the world to ensure that the responsibilities of vessel owners and skippers are clear, that the minimum age is enforced, that medical examinations are undertaken, that vessels are sufficiently crewed and that workers get enough rest. Also that they have written contracts, as Christina said, that they have rights to repatriation, that they don't pay for their jobs and they're not put on blacklists for complaining and having their sort of life chances curtailed as a result of standing up for their rights, to ensure that the recruitment agencies are properly regulated and that once on board, the living accommodation, food and water, occupational safety and health, medical care are all provided and that fishers benefit from social security. I'm going to talk very briefly about some of the ITF projects, but around the world we support our affiliates in organizing programs, in strategic campaigns all across the seafood supply chain. We develop and promote regional and global collective bargaining initiatives. We campaign for the Work in Fishing Convention ratification, and we work with regulators to ensure decent work for fishers. In Thailand, we've been organizing fishers for the last 6 or 7 years. We now have over 5,000 members of the Fishers' Rights Network. Migrant workers in Thailand make up 99% of the Thai workforce, but are not allowed to join unions or organize. So we've set up a proto-union for these workers. In the UK, we've been working, handling immigration cases, wage disputes, unfair dismissal, and accidents which go unreported. We've been working with regulators and policymakers to change the loopholes that have enabled people to be brought into the UK and not paid according to UK minimum wage and not treated the same as share fishers or European fishers have been. We provide information in the languages that workers speak, and we've been distributing these through ports in the UK, but also more widely. In Ireland, we've got a nearly 10-year history of working to change the policy landscape to ensure that migrant fishers there get the same rights as anyone should have in Ireland. We were successful in scrapping the atypical scheme and ensuring now that all migrant workers in the Irish fishing fleet will have the same rights and protections that Irish workers would. In Latin America, we're supporting our affiliates in projects and campaigns. Take one example in Argentina, where obviously the current government under Javier Milei is very anti-trade union, so we're supporting them in standing up for trade union rights. We're working with our affiliates in both Brazil and Uruguay to organize and run campaigns around C-188 ratification. And we've also been working with the ILO in Peru and Ecuador, running training for labor, fisheries, and maritime safety inspectors when it comes to setting up joint inspections for fishing vessels when these countries hopefully ratify the Work in Fishing Convention. In West Africa, we've been running a project for a number of years, including Senegal, Ivory Coast, and Ghana, building capacity among trade unions to help organize artisanal and industrial fishers, and also to campaign for the terms of the EU Sustainable Fisheries Partnership Agreements with these West African states to be upheld when it comes to working conditions and in particular pay. Finally, we also have, of our network of 140 ITF inspectors, we have 14 who are trained to run fishing vessel inspections. We're hoping to grow that fish support network to work with partners such as Stella Maris and others around the world to ensure that we have coverage in all of the most important fishing ports in the world so that we can deal with workers, deal with their cases, and get them justice and remedy if they've been exploited or abused. Thank you all very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Chris, for your presentation that I would like to resume in 2 sentences that you said. First of all, you said that fishers are an invisible working force, and after out of sight, out of mind, this is the reality of the fishing industry. Now I would like to call on Father Marcio Toniazzo, that is the Executive Director of the Scalabrini International Migration Network. SIM is an umbrella organization established in 2007 and inspired by St. John Baptist Scalabrini. His mission is to safeguard and promote the dignity and the right of migrants, refugees, internally displaced people, seafarers and fishers worldwide. SIM advocates for the dignity and the right of migrants, refugees, and fishers. So joining us online from New York is Father Toniazzo.
Thank you, Father Bruno. And distinguished colleagues in this important and challenging area of advocacy and work. On behalf of the Scalabrini International Migration Network, SIM, I wish to share insights from the extensive experience of Scalabrinian chaplains dedicated to the service of seafarers and fishers worldwide. Our Stella Maris Scalabrinian Catholic Network, in which Father Bruno participates with his extensive experience, operates in 13 ports across the globe, offering daily support to seafarers and fishers, providing spiritual guidance, lodging, food, legal advice and assistance, protection to victims of human trafficking, and accompaniment of fishers' families to improve their living conditions, in addition of promoting advocacy programs. According to the testimonies of our Stella Maris chaplains who are participating in this event, the colleagues faced by fishers are significant and persistent, requiring urgent responses with specific protection programs and policies. These challenges include high mortality and workplace accidents, as Chris just mentioned in his very important presentation. The fishing industry remains one of the most dangerous professions in the world, with alarming rates of workplace fatalities and injuries. ILO just presented the problem of isolation and loneliness, because many fishers endure prolonged periods at sea, often without access to communication tools that allow them to maintain contact with their loved ones. This isolation takes a toll on their mental well-being. Poor living and working conditions, like unsanitary environments, inadequate rest, as Noel mentioned before in his testimony. Extended hours of labor are common complaints among fishers. Some are even denied the right to disembark when the vessels return to port, leaving them confined on board. Withheld wages and financial exploitation. For example, cases of unpaid or delayed salaries are disturbingly frequent, leaving fishers and their families in financial distress. Mental health challenges. For example, the combination of isolation, grueling work conditions, and financial insecurity exacerbates the mental health struggles of fishers. Lack of a global adoption of Convention 188. A substantial number of nations have yet to ratify the Working Fishing Convention 2007, which establishes critical labor standards for fishers. Just to mention that is a call to action. As a network committed to support fishers and their families, in addition of advocating for their rights and well-being, the Stella Maris Calabrian Catholic Network is actively working to encourage more countries to ratify Convention 188. This international instrument is crucial to ensuring safer working conditions, fair treatment, and greater protections for fishers, including hours of work, rest periods, medical care, and social security. Despite its significance, the Adoption Working Fishing Convention remains incomplete. Without broader ratification and implementation, countless fishers continue to be exposed to unsafe and exploitative conditions. The ratification of the Convention 188 by more countries would not only create legally binding obligations to protect fishers, but also foster accountability across the fishing industry. Just to mention some benefits: enhanced safety standards, better living conditions, fair treatment, as Jessica Park presented according to her research. The ratification ensures that fishers receive regular and timely wages, reducing their vulnerability to financial exploitation, health and welfare protections, and global uniformity. The prevention strategies and measures, we can say that in addition to advocating for the ratification of the convention, several measures can be introduced to mitigate risk and prevent abuse in this fishing industry. Some of them we can mention that strengthening inspections and enforcement. Governments must increase inspections of fishing vessels to ensure compliance with the labor standards and penalize violators. Providing communication tools, offering fishers access to reliable communication technologies can alleviate isolation and enable them to report abuses. Raising awareness. Educational campaigns can empower fishers with knowledge in their rights and available resources. In this point, we are working so hard in our network. Creating support networks. Faith-based and non-governmental organizations can establish safe spaces where fishers can seek assistance and share their concerns. We have worked with Kevin Island in some projects in this area, and we have some points that we are developing with our network. Promoting ethical supply chains, consumers and businesses can demand transparency and ethical practices in the fishing industry. In a conclusion, the abuse of fishers is a global issue that demands immediate and sustained action. By advocating for the ratification of Convention 188 and implementing effective prevention strategies, we can address the systemic challenges faced by fishers and ensure their rights are protected. As Stella Maris Calabrian Catholic Network, we remain steadfast in our commitment to this cause. Together, we can build a future where every fisher works in conditions of dignity, safety, and fairness. Let us continue to champion their rights and make their voices heard. Thank you.
For your presentation, for sharing the work that the Stella Maris chaplain and volunteer they are doing around the world, the fact that they are doing also education with the fishers so that they know their rights but also their duty. Thank you for underlining the importance of advocacy for human and labor rights of the fishers and the ratification of the C-188 that would bring also accountability to many of the government that are responsible for this sector of the fishing. Also, you raised the issue of mental well-being of the seafarers. There is a lot of talk of mental well-being on the shipping industry, but not much on the fishing industry. So it's important that people will know that all these different abuses, physical and mental abuses, they provoke some stress on the mind of the fishers. And now, last but not the least, I would like to introduce Mr. Kevin Hyland. He was the former UK government first independent anti-slavery commissioner from 2014 to 2018, and now is a chief executive of Preveni Global. Kevin Hyland was a police officer for 30 years. In 2010, he was appointed as head of the Scotland Yard Human Trafficking Unit. Throughout his policing career, he led investigation including into homicide, gun crime, anti-corruption, and then human trafficking and slavery. Being the first independent anti-slavery commissioner of United Kingdom, he led the effort to tackle slavery and human trafficking. In 2018, he was elected as Ireland representative for human trafficking to the Council of Europe group of experts. He continued his mission to fight against human trafficking by helping to establish the Santa Marta Group, a body comprising international law enforcement agencies, civil society, NGOs, and the Catholic Church, and is a board member of several human trafficking organizations in the UK and US. So joining us online from London is Mr. Hyland. The floor is yours, Kevin.
Thank you very much, Father Bruno, and thank you very much for everyone who's joined today. And apologies that I can't be with you. I'm actually in Dublin, where I'm required here for other reasons. So today obviously is a day where we are thinking and remembering and highlighting the issue of the risk to people who are working in an industry, as we heard from Chris, that is very hidden. But it's something that engages with us all in our daily lives. We see it, the products of it, in our supermarkets, in our restaurants, in our shops. But very little is known about how those products got to where they are for the consumer. And those are the issues that I would like to look at, is around how we can prevent this industry from being one that has risk. It is a profession that is tough. It is a profession that has risks by the fact that you are at sea and you are often away from your loved ones and often away from the next person who may be able to help you. But the issue of exploitation and human trafficking and modern slavery that occur within these industries is actually something that is a deliberate act. It doesn't happen by chance. To be a victim of modern slavery and human trafficking, it is a deliberate act by an individual, a group of individuals, an organized crime group, an institution or a business or a government. And so what that gives us is opportunities for intervention, opportunities around prevention. And as we heard from Father Marcio, is that so many countries haven't adopted the very protocol that's needed and ratified that convention in order that we see this crime pushed out, so that there are rules and regulations that govern this industry. So when we look at the global world and the global world of human trafficking, this generates $236 billion every year for criminals. And some of those criminals are in white collar jobs. We often think about the trafficking and we think about the trafficking of women and sexual exploitation, which we know is shocking. But actually it's the institutions, the socio-economic norms that have allowed this to happen. And that's what we need to challenge at the global level. And this week I was in the G20 in Brazil. And I was shocked that on Thursday of last week and Friday, there was nothing in the G20 to actually specifically say that it was going to oppose modern slavery, human trafficking, forced labour and child exploitation. But it did talk about the standards for employment, which was a very positive fact, that it was contained the rights of unions and the rights of collective bargaining should become something that is promoted. But in the entire document, it doesn't mention the marine or the fishing industry at all, which shows that even at the global level, in a country that would be very active on fishing, in a business or a network that is looking at the economics and the social structures of the world, this hasn't featured as an individual item. Yet it will talk about agriculture, it will talk about other issues that are very close to its heart. So why is it that fishing, why is it that the people who are working in the marine industry are not focusing in these big debates? And that, I think, is, as we've heard, because they are marginalized. This is because they're out of mind, but also it's because of where many of them come from. That in our world, in my world here in Dublin, many people come from around the world to be in the fishing industry. And even when they come forward and they present themselves and they're victims and the evidence is there, the support isn't there just to give to them. And not only is the support not there, their ability to find justice, their ability to find remedy is very often blocked by the institutions that are there to help them, particularly when it comes to the state. So we need to be doing far more on these issues. And one of the things that's happening is national referral mechanisms are being developed in more and more countries. But I don't think I see national referral mechanisms that really consider people who are 100 miles at sea or further away. So we need to be able to include this in some of the reforms that are happening or intended from the G20. Now, thankfully, on Monday of this week, the G20 agreed to include modern slavery, human trafficking, forced labour and child labour into the declaration on recommendation 31. That gives us an opportunity to talk about this at the highest level. But then in the recommendations, they further talk about the reform of global governance institutions. And I think that gives us a real opportunity to start looking at the governance institutions that are supposed to be helping us on this issue. And some of those organisations need to come back to the reality of what the victims of these exploitation suffer, but also where are the possibilities of prevention. More needs to be done on prevention, a lot more effort about how this industry in particular is managed. And that actually is where the project that I'm going to be leading now around raising $30 billion by 2030 to start to deliver the reality of the Sustainable Development Goals, including the 4 development goals that mention human trafficking, and in particular 8.7. Because at the moment it's reported by the UN Secretary General that we are only achieving 17% of the goals, and yet we're 2/3 of the way through them. So this push on the issue of human trafficking, including in particular the fishing industry, is central to what I think needs to be done. And there's a number of reasons. A lot of fishers who travel, migrant workers in general, they travel in order to take money, to get money to send home for remittances to their families. But we know also that they are paying really high, extortionate remittance fees, around 8 to 11%. Whereas us, the privileged, we don't pay any remittance fees because our banks do it for us. And also they charge recruitment fees, and also they get charged for accommodation, and then they are exploited in their industry either through racism, through abuse and violence, and through not getting paid. So we need to focus on the issues around prevention. And one of the things is around remittances. We need to introduce a system that protects the $870 billion every year that travels around in remittances. And 660 billion of that is low and middle income countries. And pro rata, the country with the most remittances is the Philippines, where we know there are many fishers. And if we can increase the amount of money that gets back to those families, that will allow development to happen of those families, particularly at a time when development money and ODA funds are reducing. So we need to be thinking different. And when the G20 talks about the reform of global governance institutions, that's what we need to be doing. Not that they're reforming themselves in what they're doing internally, but what are they doing externally? Are they engaged in the real issues and the real challenges that lay ahead of them? I've met a number of fishers here in Ireland who have been trafficked from different places in the world, including from the Philippines and from Africa. And the way they were treated, the way they were responded to, was shameful. And I don't know why that happens, but it's because people think they should be tough. They should be able to endure it. Sometimes I think it might be because they're foreign nationals. Sometimes it may be thought they're lazy or they're chancers. But when you actually hear their stories, when you see what they've endured in a country like Ireland or a country like the UK, their suffering is shocking. So that is what we need to respond to. And I'm certainly going to use the statements made by the G20, the reform of global governance, to actually become something that we can start to deliver at the international level, but create accountability so that we actually see delivery of all these promises that go back to 1919, when the ILO was formed, which was about pay, and to the 1926 Slavery Convention and the 1930 Forced Labour Convention. Now, 100 years on, we're still talking about it. I think over the next 5 years, aligned to the Sustainable Development Goals, we need to deliver, and we need to deliver measures that actually prevent this from happening in the first place. And when it suddenly does happen, victims are properly supported, and those who could commit the offences are held to account. Thank you very much.
Enlarge our vision and brought us to your project of raising $30 billion by 2030. For sure, I think you will have all the support from us, and if there will be some share for all of us working within the welfare for the fishers, we'll be even more happy. Now we have 5 minutes if there is any question. First, I will ask here on the floor if there is any question. So we have the Philippines, and just identify yourself and tell us to whom you are going to address this question.
Yes,
thank you.
Thank you, Father Ciceri. I am Lou from the Permanent Mission of the Philippines. First off, I would just like to thank on behalf of my government, the Sovereign Order of Malta for organizing this and also for inviting the Philippines to co-sponsor this very, very important event. Obviously, as has been mentioned by Mr. Highland and other speakers, this is an issue of great importance to the Philippines. About 2% of seafarers who leave the country annually would include fishers. The majority would be the normal seafarers that run ships, commercial ships all around the world. So the stories of abuses and difficult working and living conditions shared by Noel from Ghana and of course Mr. Highland are not strangers to us, are not a stranger issue to us. So we are very familiar with this, and domestically we've made significant movements towards fixing our own mechanisms to provide more protections, particularly on the prevention side. Very recently, we have adopted the Seafarers Magna Carta of Seafarers, which specifically provides stronger mechanisms, frameworks, and rules to protect our seafarers, including fishers. And But of course, there is a greater demand for more collaboration by different stakeholders because we can only do so much domestically. Now, my question is for our colleague from ILO. Why is there so very, very few state parties to the Convention on Fisheries compared to the MLC, for instance, which has near universal ratification? Even the CMW would have more numbers of ratifying states. So I would like to know more about the reasons why there is so much hesitancy and resistance from states, including all the big players in the industry. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Well, it depends. So the challenges are, of course, the very broad scope of application of the convention, which of course covers not only industrial fishing, but also small-scale and artisanal fishing. It only excludes subsistence fishing. So that for many countries is a challenge. But also there is an increased will to tackle that challenge by, first of all, tackling the informal economy. I think the COVID-19 pandemic is also maybe linked to that, the will to, the realization that a huge part of the workforce is invisible because of informality, and the will to tackle that. So that is the ambitious scope of the convention, and I think many countries are working on it, but may wish to ratify only when, implementation is secured. Others probably are quite advanced in implementation and just underestimate maybe the importance of ratifying. I would like to emphasize the importance of ratifying Convention 188, even if there are regional instruments in place of implementing the content of Convention 188. But if we want an international level playing field that protects not only fishers but also fishing vessel owners committed to decent work against unfair competition, etc., I think a universal or widespread ratification of Convention 188 is essential. Yes, I think that is. I think maybe another challenge of the convention is the coordination that was brought up in several speeches. The coordination of so many authorities that is really indispensable to effectively implement. And I've seen that many countries, be they in Africa or in Europe, the US is also trying to, implement certain standards of Convention 188. All have acknowledged that coordinating maritime authorities, fisheries, and labor authorities to effectively implement and enforce standards for fishers is very challenging. So that might be another aspect.
Thank you very much, Christine, for your answer. I give the floor to the lady. Please identify yourself and be brief and concise on your question. Okay, thank you.
So Alev Mine of the One Goal Initiative for Governance. A question for Mr. Hyland. What would it take in a regulatory, legal perspective, changes in international law? What would it require in order to make national referral mechanisms apply far out in the sea? And when those changes are made, in which other framework would those changes apply also? And also, what infrastructure do you suggest or regulations do you suggest to change the charges in the fees for remittances? And a question for the lady on a line. Who was it? I missed the name of who or which framework uses the contract renewal as a proxy for working conditions? Thank you.
You answered the first question, and I think the second question was addressed to Jessica, I think.
Yes, thank you. Well, one of the things they should be doing with NRMs is the people who are at sea and the ports, etc., where these people who have been victims appear, there's no duty on anyone in the fishing industry or in the maritime industry who may be in a governance role, or, and when I say governance role, I mean including captains, to report. And the legislation needs to change to put a duty on them, just like we have duties on other institutions, even if they're not state institutions around safety of children. Every business has a role around health and safety and to report it. So first of all, they need to know that this sits with them, and their failure to report it will mean that them, as the captain, will be in for failing to report in the first place, even before you get to the point of the trafficking. So we need to extend who has the duty to report and what they have to do. And then within that, it has to be, you know, if somebody's injured and seriously hurt, that they have to take steps. And if they, even that means coming back to port, that's what they have to do. So I think looking at that, I think one of the things, I was recently in China, and they are really concerned. And when I say concerned, they're now taking steps because of the EU directive, which is going to come with a sanction. And that sanction is going to be up to 4% of your turnover for a big company. That is waking up companies severely, because they know that actually they're going to lose the ability to trade. They're going to lose all of their access to things that they would normally do because they're not governing their systems properly. So I think it's about the reality of turning these, what we have as commitments, you know, global commitments or commitments, into something that can work in the front line. And that means we have to change some of the areas of responsibility. Who is accountable and how are they accountable? They don't do what they're supposed to do, how they're sanctioned.
So, in my experience, a lot of companies, buyers, retailers, etc., they fail to directly engage with workers. They tend to, you know, we've heard from myself and others on this panel that it is difficult to collect data, but often they use that as an excuse, which might feel a bit harsh, but I think it is. And they do a lot of desk-based social audits. And so you're limited in the information that you can assess sitting in a desk in North America or Europe versus out there talking to the fishers in a safe manner that protects them from retaliation. And so one of the things that they look for in those desk-based assessments is whether or not there have been contract renewals. And if there have been contract renewals, that often gets a tick that, well, who would renew a contract if, you know, there were bad working conditions? And I think that's something that the data that we have directly challenges, that that's not a meaningful proxy for engaging the fishers and your supply chain in a safe way that protects them from retaliation.
Jessica, and we came to the conclusion, and I will give the floor to Michelle that will have the concluding remarks.
Thank you very much, Father Ciceri. In closing this important event, let me once again thank all the co-organizers, co-sponsors and speakers, both in person and online, and all those who participated, both in person and online. My special thanks go to Father Bruno Ciceri, our moderator, and to Kevin Highland, the originator of this event in Geneva. We will continue our collaboration in Geneva and online with more events and webinars. You are all welcome to join us, with our best wishes to all of you, to the fishermen and their helpers. Goodbye now.